and say that.
Oh, all the better. So I think we will give it about 1 more minute, maybe 2. I've noticed that some people are still connecting to audio, so I don't want to cut anybody off, but we do want to kind of get started as close as we can to 8 o'clock to make sure we don't fall behind if there is a good number of questions, which we're hoping, Leah and myself, to answer any questions through these most common questions that we will discuss here shortly. Okay, so we'll go ahead and get started now. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for logging in. It sounds funny to say, and I'll be candid with all of you. This is going to be my very first Zoom presentation, so please be kind to me since this is my first rodeo. I'm sure a lot of you have already gone through this several times. I've done many meetings on Zoom, but never actually presented. My name is Jaime Borrego. I'm Associate Director of Financial Aid here at Carroll College. I am the current MASFAA president. So MASFAA is the Montana Association of Student Financial Aid Administrators. And I have the privilege today to be discussing with you guys the top 10 questions with my presenting partner, Leah, and I'll have her introduce herself here shortly.
I'm Leah Habel, and I'm the Director of Financial Aid at Great Falls College MSU, a 2-year college in Great Falls, Montana. I've been in financial aid for a number of years and have served as MASFAA president in the past as well. And I was happy to get the call from Jaime to help him out with this presentation. Also my first Zoom presentation, but we're excited to visit with you a little bit about the FAFSA. And I'm sure that's not any of your first rodeo when it comes to FAFSA, and in this world of 1,000 changes this day and age. At least the FAFSA hasn't changed that much from last year, so that's good news.
All right, thank you, Leah. So today's presentation will frequently ask FAFSA questions that we see during FAFSA nights. FAFSA nights will probably look a little bit different for everybody this year, but FAFSA nights are a really good indicator for us of what we are expected to hear from students kind of moving forward, especially our students students and parents who have a child going to college for the first time. Those questions are always the ones we try to key in on most, because those are the ones that are the more challenging, and they might come up to a hurdle and maybe not feel comfortable filling it out and not complete the FAFSA, which we know the FAFSA is pretty critical for students' ability to afford college. So these are the questions we hear most often. Plus, during the academic year, when we have students visit our campuses around the state, these are questions that we hear from both students and parents. And this is just a list of the most common ones. Of course, this is not every question that ever comes across our desk, or phone calls or emails that we get. So please, if you do have any more questions beyond these most common ones, feel free to ask them either during the presentation, or at the end. We do have some time reserved for Q&A. So please don't hesitate to ask us anything that you guys might be wondering or considering, or maybe you've already heard questions if it has come up with your students with the start of semester a couple weeks ago. So without further ado, let's go ahead and jump into the first one. So the first question: what if I have more than 10 colleges I want to list on the FAFSA? So normally when we get these, I usually just say, well, good luck trying to decide between 10 colleges, because I'm sure you guys as high school counselors know how difficult it is for students to apply for a college and try to keep them sorted and waiting to hear back. There's a lot of things to consider when applying for one college, let alone 10. But in the event that a student does want to have more than 10 colleges listed, the student has a couple of options to do so. First off, they want to start off submitting the FAFSA to all 10 of the colleges and then leave off whichever ones they decide. And then they could go in later on and remove a couple of the schools, 1, 2, depending on how many they have over the 10, and resubmit the FAFSA with the new schools added on there. The couple other options that they have get a little more complicated. They would have to give the DRN, which is the data release number, to the school they are interested in attending. That way, that school who did not receive that initial FAFSA could log in on the administrative side and download the FAFSA. Is there a question? Oh, sorry.
Jaime, I was just going to suggest if the attendants could please mute their microphones. We're getting a little bit of feedback.
Oh.
And then if you have a question, unmute yourself and go ahead and ask it. But in the meantime, if you would leave your mics on mute, that would be helpful. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Leah. My headphones, I guess, does a really good job with blocking out all the feedback, so I haven't really heard much. So please, if you have not put yourselves on mute, please do so. So kind of jumping back into it. So requesting that DRN number, the school can ask for that FAFSA to be submitted to them without the student having to go back in and make any changes. They could also call and ask the FAFSA to have that the FAFSA sent over to whichever schools, but just know that there's a limit of how many you can have them do for you, or you could print out the SAR, which is the student aid report, and fill and manually write in the new schools and mail it back to get the FAFSAs added, the schools added to the FAFSA. So as you can see, it gets a little more complicated. The easiest way is definitely just removing a couple of schools and adding the new ones if there are more than 10. Honestly, in my 10 years of financial aid experience, I have never seen a student come close to having 10 schools on their FAFSA. Is it possible? Absolutely. I'm sure some of you out there might have already talked to students who have had 10 or more schools that they're interested in, but I've never seen it. So I haven't really had to deal with this issue, but just know that if it does come up, the easiest way is just to remove the schools and then add them the next submission if there are more than 10. Okay.
I would say it's probably more common for students to not add schools they're thinking of. Sometimes we get them coming to our school and maybe we're the 3rd or 4th choice and they didn't put our school code on because they put their number 1, they just knew they were going to go to Harvard and they didn't list any backups. So I would say that that's probably a little more common to encourage your students to list any schools they think they might be planning to attend, even if it's not their first choice, so that they don't have to go back and add that school code later, which they still can do, but it just kind of saves a little bit of time for them.
Yes, thanks for adding that, Leah, because it doesn't hurt any of the schools. It doesn't make a difference to the student. It just keeps the students' options open. So Leah, thank you for making that point. If they don't add it and then they come into a school and say, hey, I'm waiting to receive my financial aid notification, if we don't have the FAFSA, we can't really provide additional financial aid information for them. So yeah, I encourage them to include any school that they're interested, A, B, all the way through J, since that would be the 10th school if there is. So what is considered a special circumstance? So there's different situations where a student can find themselves in a pickle, for lack of a better phrase, where they're not too sure what to do because the financial information that is being requested on the FAFSA is significantly different than what it currently is. So in these circumstances, every institution across the state as well as the country has the option to review the student's financial information and other factors in what we call a special circumstance. And in those special circumstances, the schools would be the ones determining what adjustments, if any. I think there's somebody that's not on mute, sorry. If there are any special circumstances that the school can make corrections to the FAFSA information, it will be up to the school to do it. So just as an example, let's say with the 3 schools on that slide, let's say Carroll, University of Providence, and Rocky Mountain College, there's a student considering all 3, and they do have a special circumstance, especially right now because of COVID. COVID caused a lot of issues financially for a lot of families. And let's say that the 2019 tax information that will be requested on the FAFSA for the upcoming year shows an AGI that is not remotely close to what it is now. Each of those 3 schools can review those circumstances, but each of those 3 schools might come up with a different answer to what the special circumstances entail. So it might not be the same at each of the schools, but each of the schools can do it if they choose to. A couple other things that come up is if there's a death or an illness. So if the FAFSA gets submitted, let's say in October of this year, and then come May, and there was an unfortunate event where someone passed away, one of the parents might have passed away, or there's a severe illness, then that would be considered a special circumstance where the college could review the situation and decide if they will adjust any of the financial information on there. I think there might be somebody off mute again. Just as a reminder, if you could mute yourselves, we'd appreciate it. Unusual medical or dental expenses. So those, as we know, can get very expensive. But we have to remember that it's the medical expenses that are not covered by insurance. Unfortunately, there are times that we've received documentations where it shows a really high medical bill, but when we read through it, it was covered by insurance. So since the family's not paying anything out of their pocket, it's not something that we normally would look at. But again, if you're not too sure, definitely talk to a financial aid administrator and they can kind of walk you through that. And then the last one, other unusual circumstances. So because this is always a case by case and every school might do it a little differently, the best bet is for them to contact that specific school. I do know there's schools around there that don't even review special circumstances. It's in their policies to not review any for anybody under any circumstance. So it doesn't hurt to ask a school once the student is kind of getting closer. So as you guys, as high school counselors, know your students and kind of know, oh, these students have some outstanding circumstances or some unique situations, know that these are the common ones that we see, but they're definitely not the only ones. So if the student is a little more confident as to where they want to apply, definitely have them reach out to those schools, because all financial aid administrators would be happy to work with students with special circumstances. Leah, do you have anything to add on this one?
I would just say that the number of cases of the request for special circumstances has increased since the FAFSA went to that prior year several years ago, and we started looking at a full year of taxes 2 years back. It's a little more common for, it's most common for a family's income to kind of stay pretty even keel, which is why they decided that going back to using 2 years ago taxes was a little bit more helpful, because students could get their FAFSA done during the same time that they're applying for their college applications, and it lines up a little bit better. Most families don't have significant changes, and I think that's a key thing. It needs to be kind of a significant change. It can't be, oh, this year I made 50,000 and last year I made 52,000. That's probably not going to cause a big enough effect in the change of, in the results of the FAFSA. But we do see a little bit more of those, so families should not feel like they can't ask for those adjustments if it is really very different. So just let people know that.
Thank you. Are there deadlines for FAFSA? So the FAFSA, as we all know, is available coming up in here in the next week and a half on October 1st. The state of Montana, all the schools within the state have decided that our priority deadline, so it's not a deadline where you're out of luck if it's not submitted by then, but the priority deadline is December 1. So as high school counselors, I would encourage all of you to encourage all of your high school seniors who are considering attending a college next year to submit the FAFSA as soon as they can after October 1. Since the tax information that will be asked for the FAFSA is the 2009 tax information, chances are those taxes have already been filed. So that won't be necessarily a hurdle that it might have been a few years back of having to wait for taxes to be completed. In this case, they should probably already be completed. And just let them know that the deadline is for priority financial aid. So there are certain types of aid that a student might miss out on if the FAFSA is not submitted by that date. There's certain types of need-based financial aid, like federal work study, for example. Sometimes those funds get spent prior to students submitting the FAFSA, and if they submitted late, they might not have federal work studies funds available at that institution any longer if this deadline is not made. So just remember also, if they missed the December 1 deadline, it doesn't mean, okay, I can't fill out anymore, I'm out of luck, maybe I'll try next year. No, please still encourage the students to fill it out after December 1. Believe it or not, I had a student submit his FAFSA to our school yesterday. So the deadline is really going to be June of 2022. So they have plenty of time to still fill it out past the December 1 priority deadline. But that is the day we encourage our students to get it taken care of. And that way, once they're receiving their financial aid offers from the number of schools from around the state or maybe around the country, they could compare the financial aid offers because that FAFSA has been submitted, which will include not just any scholarships or grants they're receiving from the institution they apply to, but also any of the federal aid that also can add up. And a lot of students think, oh, I might not be eligible for it. You don't really know unless you apply. So again, the encouragement is to get that submitted by December 1, since that is the state of Montana's priority deadline. And just as a side note, lower on that slide, you could see every state might have a different priority deadline. Some might be later, some might be earlier. So if there's a student that says, oh, I'm going to school XY in state Z and W, then you want to check that state to see what their priority deadline is. And within that state, some schools might have a different one. They might say, the state might say it's March 1, but the school they're interested in might say, oh, we're February 1, because we decided we wanted to go a little bit earlier. To just let them know that it can vary from state to state as well as from school to school. Here in the state of Montana, we've talked it out and we decided that we would all go with the December 1 priority deadline. So next question, how do I know if my school or schools have received my FAFSA? So the FAFSA itself takes about 3 to 5 days to process once it gets submitted. Once that gets submitted, the student will receive a link with their student aid report. That student aid report will be essentially all the information that the student provided for the FAFSA and have other information kind of behind the scenes for the student as well regarding federal loans, grants, eligibility for those programs, if the student was selected for a process called verification that we'll talk about here in a second. So that student aid report is the proof that it went through and everything was successful. If there were any issues with it, the student aid report will tell you these are the problems with the FAFSA. And chances are the school will contact the student letting them know of any issues that might have come up with the FAFSA submission. Each of the colleges will have the information one day after it's been processed, but also note that each college will have a different timeline on when they will begin processing. I'll speak on behalf of Carroll just as an example. The FAFSA will be available October 1. We will probably begin downloading them into our server probably around the week of the 7th or 8th. We try to usually download them as soon as we can to kind of see what we're working with and get the financial aid prepared. There might be schools out there that might wait a little bit longer. So each of the schools will have a different timeline that they're working with, and each of the schools will communicate that to their students regarding, oh, this is when we will have financial aid offers ready. This is about the time when we will start sending those out. So just know, because one school has already reached out to the student saying, hey, we got your FAFSA, and another school has not, that doesn't necessarily mean the other school did not receive the FAFSA. It might just be that their processing timeline would be different than that first school that reached out to them. Leah, do you have anything to add how you guys do things at Great Falls?
No, I think you covered that really well. I would just say, you know, on the MSU side of the house, so Montana State University, MSU Northern, MSU Billings, and us, MSU, or Great Falls College, MSU, we share a computer system, our banner system. So we do have to take turns downloading that information. So just as Jaime said, some schools may do that download from the Department of Education on a daily basis. Others might do it on a weekly basis. So I think that that's just a really important point. If you have Carroll and Great Falls College both on your FAFSA, and you hear from Carroll College immediately and don't hear from Great Falls College as quickly, that doesn't necessarily mean. You could probably make that assumption that if you've heard from one school, that all the schools you listed have received that FAFSA. But that processing time can definitely vary, especially between private and state schools, because oftentimes the state schools need to wait for their tuition fees to be set by the state. And so there are things that we may wait on before we're offering up those aid packages, just to make sure they're the most accurate they can be.
Thank you. So verification, I briefly touched on this a little while ago, but what is verification? So verification is required by some students. Not every student is selected for the process called verification. It's about 30% of students will be selected for verification. And the verification is the process of verifying the information provided on the FAFSA. So the institution will normally ask for a student to fill out a verification worksheet, which is ask general information about the family household, who lives in the household, who the parents support financially, which of those students they're supporting financially are attending a college. And then it's also going to require tax information. This is the really important part, in my opinion, with the verification process. If the student and or the parent are able to upload their tax information using the data retrieval tool, the IRS data retrieval tool on the FAFSA, that they don't have to provide any physical tax documents if they're able to upload those successfully. So if you're helping a student submit the FAFSA, let's say on a FAFSA night, or maybe they're in your office and you're getting it submitted, and you have that option to submit the tax information via the IRS data retrieval tool, I would highly recommend and encourage you to do so. It makes things a lot easier for the student and for the institution involved, because can you imagine, I call a student and say, hey, we need your parents' 2019 IRS tax transcript. They might not know what that means. And as we all know, that game, I believe it's called phone booth, where you pass the message along. What do you think that student will tell their parents? Hey, Carol called, he wants your tax ID. And that might not make any sense to the parent, because that's not what we're requesting. So if they are able to submit those taxes via the IRS data retrieval tool, it makes things a lot easier. In some circumstances, they will not have the option to fill it out if there's a marital change, if they filed a foreign tax return. So there's a few caveats where they will not be able to use it. But for those who can use it, we highly encourage you to do so. And also it makes it a lot easier, and it removes any type of user error. A lot of the tax information it asks for example, it says, look on line 13, subtracted from Schedule 1, line 46. For us in the financial aid office, that might make sense, but as a parent who has never completed a FAFSA, they might not have the Schedule 1 on hand and not know what that looks like. So they're trying to fumble through these tax documents and making sure they're filling in the right number that they're being asked for. It can be very frustrating for some parents. I've worked with parents who get really frustrated trying to figure out what these lines are on these schedules. There's now schedules 1, 2, 3, 4. There's all these things when it comes to tax forms. So to avoid all of that, the best thing a parent and a student could do is use the IRS data retrieval tool. If they are able to, the IRS will upload all the correct tax information for them right off the bat. And if the student is selected for verification, that will be just one less thing the student will have to submit to the school if they are selected for that process. It will just be the worksheet, and then they're done. So it saves a lot of time for both the student and the parent if they're able to upload the tax information.
I would just add a couple of things to that, Jaime. Using the IRS data retrieval tool, again, very much preferred, but remember then they can't change those answers. So you might upload it, and now with the FAFSA, it's a little better because a lot of that stuff is hidden, even from the applicants. They upload it from the IRS DRT and can't really see what those answers are. Before that was in play, they would do it, and then they would say, "Oh, that."
So for some reason, I can't hear this. I'm not sure.
Oh,
Sure.
She might.
Oh,
Looks like she has.
okay.
can you hear me now? Yes. Okay, good. Sorry about that. Just be sure that they don't try to change the answers once uploading that IRS DRT. I think I was saying, I don't know how much you heard, so I apologize, but beforehand you could upload the information and see what it was. You could see that adjusted gross income, the tax amounts paid. Now all of that is kind of hidden for privacy purposes, so that helps. But we would have families upload the data retrieval tool and then look at that AGI and be, oh, I don't think that's right, and then they would manipulate it. That sort of then undoes that ability for us to use the IRS data retrieval tool as a verification item. So if they're using the data retrieval tool, they should not be changing any numbers then after the fact in order for us to be able to. They just need to trust that it's accurate, and it has been. The other thing I wanted to add was, if you do not use the IRS data retrieval tool and then get selected for that verification process, another way other than turning in the tax return transcripts in a paper format is FAFSAs, or is that families can go out to the FAFSA and do a correction to use the data retrieval tool. The schools will get that subsequent transaction of the FAFSA, and that can be a way for them to provide that information. And we actually prefer that too. It's often quite a bit faster than families trying to request the tax transcript or dig around and find that information to turn into the schools. So even if they don't initially use the IRS DRT, if they get picked for verification, if they're eligible for it, they can go in and make that correction and use it.
Great, thank you, Leah.
Is selection for verification a random process, or is that a combination of random and something stands out?
Yeah, so very good question. So it is a random, the federal government says it is random. No institution is really allowed to know the reason behind selection. All they ever say is it is random. However, from the financial administrator side, we know that it's always random. Plus, if there's something that stands out and or if there's some type of federal need-based financial aid, since need-based financial aid is tax dollars funded, they want to make sure that the need-based funding, being tax dollars, is going to the students who are eligible for it. So if a student initially shows to have need-based eligibility, from our perspective, it appears that those are the ones most often selected to ensure that those funding sources are adequately being spent on the students who do have the most financial need. But if you ask anybody with the Department of Education, they will always say it's random.
Jamie?
Yeah.
I have to leave for another meeting, and I know you're recording, but I just really need to ask this question
Yeah,
in case it's not answered. I have a student who's changing his name, and his question to me was, should I wait for my social security number card to reflect the name change, or should I, because he doesn't know how soon that card is going to be changed, or should he go ahead and just fill out the FAFSA starting in October?
So we actually run into this anytime a student gets married with the name change. If the student has not updated their name with all federal agencies, Social Security Administration, and all the other ones, your U.S. passport, all of those, then there will not be a name match and the FAFSA cannot be processed correctly. So I would recommend waiting till he receives that Social Security card with the new name. That usually is a good indicator that, okay, all federal agencies now have the new name under this Social Security with this student's date of birth. Otherwise, if that's not back yet, we might run into that issue where, oh, it's rejected because this name does not match this Social Security number with this date of birth.
That's what I figured. Okay, thank you very much.
And Leah, do you want to go ahead and take on this question?
Absolutely. This is a very common question, and I just want to check and make sure everyone can hear me this time. Yes, okay. My parents are divorced. Whose information do I use on the FAFSA? I don't like getting this question because it doesn't often make a whole lot of sense, but the rules, according to FAFSA and on the instructions for the FAFSA, is that the student should use the parent that they have lived with most in the last 12 months. Sometimes that's quite obvious and it's not even a question that comes to us. Sometimes it's not though, and so the next drop down is if number one isn't clear who provided the most financial support, and it may be that the parent they're not living with for the majority of that. Oftentimes families will come in and say that they split their time exactly evenly between their two parents. And that may be true, and if that is true, then it should be the parent that's providing the most financial support. Sometimes families confuse that with child support. Well, that is a factor of what is the financial support. Also, the factors are, providing a roof over their head and paying their lunch money and other fees for their activities. It's a total financial support, insurance, vehicles, things like that. So they should not necessarily always assume that means child support. Oh, my mom doesn't pay child support, but my dad does, so therefore I use my dad. It just sort of depends on their situation. And if neither of those answers is, then the student is supposed to choose the parent from whom they have most recently received the most financial support. So usually if you break that down for the students, they kind of can come up. The families really do know what that answer should be. It might not be the one they wanted to use on the FAFSA, but they should be using the one with the most financial support. The part that really gets confusing sometimes, though, is that if that parent that they're using on their FAFSA is married or has remarried, they need to include that parent information. We get a fair amount of students who have made that mistake, even though the parents are divorced. They're still combining their mom and their dad's financial information together, and that's not the way it should be. If they're saying mom is the one that's providing my support, then it needs to be mom and stepdad if mom has been remarried, because it's looking at that total household size financial figure. Anything to add there, Jaime? Or questions? I know that's a common one for questions.
Yeah, the only thing I want to add is a lot of times also students get hung up on that. Who did you have the majority, meaning more than 50%? And if they say, oh, I'm split evenly with my parents, I spend half the year with my mom, half the year with my dad, most years have an odd number of days. So if it comes down, they might have to actually sit down and decide, okay, who had that extra day if it wasn't a leap year? And usually by that point, they're like, okay, I'll figure out who it was. And then there's an easier way to figure out. They're just trying to, what they're wanting to hear a lot of times is, I just want to use the parent who makes the least amount of money, which chances are they might be the one who is supporting them, even though they might not earn as much as the other parent. That could very well be the parent. It doesn't, just because one parent makes more money, you don't automatically assume, okay, they're the one supporting because they make more money. No, that's not the case. It's in reality who is supporting the student more.
The next big question is, why do I have to be considered dependent? My parents don't support me. This one's also hard. Jaime, you gave me all the hard ones. Oftentimes, you know, we kind of live in that society, and there's a lot of parents that say, when you turn 18, you're on your own. Department of Education and the government don't necessarily agree with that. The philosophy behind the FAFSA is that it's a parent's responsibility to support their child's college education. Now, we know that that's not always the case with all students, but if you consider the big job of providing the most aid to the right students nationwide, criteria has been set up. So for FAFSA, the criteria is based on the age of 24. So for the 21-22 FAFSA cycle, the question will be, were you born before January 1st, 1997? And if the answer to that is no, and all these other questions are no, then the student is considered dependent and the parent information does have to go on the FAFSA. That does not mean that the parent has to pay the bill. It does not mean that the parent is required to take out loans on the student's behalf, but it means that the parent's information must be considered when determining the financial aid eligibility for that student. Other things that would make a student be considered independent are if they are married themselves, if they have children of their own that they are supporting. Most of you are not going to be dealing with someone going straight from high school to a graduate degree, so that one working on a graduate degree doesn't always apply in your experience. Students serving active duty in the armed forces. I will speak a little bit to that. A lot of times students will join the Army Guard or the Air National Guard. That doesn't count unless they are deployed under active duty by presidential order. So a lot of times the guard members will be doing stateside humanitarian service or get sent away for training. It has to be based on active duty. They're not in guard status to be able to answer that question is yes. Students can be veterans, have other dependents besides children that they support more than 50%. But then there's some other things that happen to students that are not the typical family type situations, orphans or students that were in foster care kind of after that age of 13. If they were in a legal guardianship or a ward of the court, some of those tricky situations that are never fun for families to be dealing with. If those situations are true, then the student may be considered independent and not have to use parental information on the FAFSA. The best way, if you've got a student who's got some troubled family situations, is to work with them and call the financial aid office, and we can kind of walk through. There's instructions for the FAFSA that tell you answer yes to this, if this, answer no, if this, but it can get a little in the weeds. So we're happy to help if you've got students in that situation. And the last one is for homelessness. That needs to be documented. So with the high school students, I'm seeing a chat that there's some audio problems again. Are others able to hear? Most of you are? Okay, so it must not be with this system. I'm sorry for whoever's having troubles with that. Homelessness, yeah. With the high schoolers, there's usually a person at the high school that's designated as the homeless liaison. A letter from that person at the high school would be available to document that situation for the student. And those are kind of the reasons that students can be considered independent instead of dependent using parent information on their FAFSA. Any questions about that or anything else to add, Jaime?
Just one last thing to add, that at each of these questions, the school the student is applying to can request additional documentation for any of these questions. Probably not the birthday one, but any of the other ones. If the student says yes, the school does have the right to say, can you provide court order documents? Can you provide a marriage certificate? Can you provide your DD-214 to prove that you are a veteran? So just know that if they do end up answering yes, that it'd be a good idea to have all the documentation ready if the school does decide to ask for any physical proof of that circumstance.
Okay, what is the EFC? You will hear us financial aid administrators throw that, well, we think of it as a word, it's really not, it's an abbreviation, EFC around a lot. The expected family contribution. I always think of it as it's kind of the one number that all of that information that's being provided on the FAFSA boils down to, is the EFC. It is the tool that we use in order to determine what type of financial aid a student may be eligible for. So it's the measure of your family's financial strength, and it's calculated according to the answers that are provided on the FAFSA and the formula that's established by law. The taxed, untaxed income, assets, benefits, household size are all considered in that formula to determine that estimated or expected family contribution. Families often get confused and get that EFC number and think that means that's what they write their check for and send it to the college. That is not the case. It's not the amount of money that you are going to have to pay for college. That may be more or less depending on what college you're going to and what kind of aid will be offered. It's also not the amount of federal student aid that will be received. So it is like I said, the best way I can think of it is it's a tool that we use to determine whether or not a student qualifies for all of the different types of aid that are available to them. And we use that, and we use that in a formula that seems very simple. The cost of attendance minus the EFC equals the student's financial need. The colleges will then try to fill as much of that financial need as they can with the different types of aid that are available to them for use. Because the aid package is created individually for students based on attending a particular school, those aid amounts are going to vary from school to school. And we have another slide after this that kind of demonstrates that a little bit better. The Pell Grants should be the same at each school. That is part of the formula that determines if your EFC is X, your Pell Grant for a full-time student will be Y. And that will apply regardless of which school that you're attending in most cases. But anything else can vary based on this formula of cost of attendance minus EFC equals need. So this slide is good because it kind of demonstrates how that can look differently at different types of colleges. Imagine that college A is a higher cost, maybe a private four-year college, and college C might be a junior college or a community college, and B might be your four-year state schools. So the cost of each of those schools is going to vary. obviously, but the green bar, the EFC, is the same and applies to the student. So every school will use that same EFC to determine the need at that college. So cost of attendance minus EFC equals need. So you can see in the last little section of bars that the need at school A is greater than the need at school C. So a lot of times the more expensive schools also have some endowments or some institutional aid that's available to help them fill that amount of need at their college to offer an aid package that makes the bottom line for the students a better. You might get more aid at Carroll College than you would at Great Falls College MSU, just because of the institutional aid options that are available. But the amount of that the student and family are paying can definitely vary based on college, as you would expect. Just know that that EFC is applied equally against the cost of each of the schools. Other questions about that? Or anything to add?
Leah, this is
Yes.
Amy.
Yes,
I just want to let you and Jaime know that we have some folks posting some questions in the
Okay.
chat. And you guys, I told them before we end, we'll come back and address all those. So
That sounds good.
awesome.
Yeah, we have about one more slide to go, and then we'll address all those questions in the chat. Thank you, guys.
Sounds great.
And then the number one question, and I would say number one comment a lot. People assume they're not going to get Pell Grants, so they don't fill out a FAFSA, and we don't want students to do that. Should I fill out a FAFSA even if I don't think I'm going to qualify? Absolutely. The FAFSA helps determine lots of things. Sometimes we have scholarships available that, even if they're not need-based scholarships, it might be a tiebreaker to look at a financial need picture. The FAFSA helps determine whether students are eligible for the federal loans, grants, or work studies, obviously, but it could be also used to determine institutional aid and all of the pieces that go into creating that aid package. Everyone should be eligible for some form of financial aid, even if it's just student loans. I know that student loans often get a bad rap, but they are a useful tool. Sometimes that is the way a student can get through their education, and they're important. They're safe, and if you are being smart about the amount that you're borrowing, they are a very doable source. So in order to receive a federal student aid or federal student loan, the FAFSA is required. A lot of times students will come in and say, well, I'm not going to get FAFSA. They always call Pell Grants FAFSA. I'm not going to get a grant, but I want to take a student loan. Did you do the FAFSA? No, I just want a loan. People don't necessarily understand that's all the same application process. So you will always hear an aid administrator say to file a FAFSA no matter what. You don't have to accept the aid. It doesn't put you on the hook for any student loans, just to do the application, and it's a free application. Again, file the FAFSA even if you missed that priority deadline. Pell Grants and student loans, it doesn't matter if you file it on the very last possible date that you're in school. If you qualify for those items, then you can get them. The priority deadline is really speaking more to those limited fund sources of aid that we run out of. And then lastly, you can have students work through the net price calculator on college websites. It's a kind of a tool that has you put in some pretty simple information related to your income and household size that kind of gives you a quick snapshot of what financial aid might be available based on the costs and the aid availability at each of the colleges. So that's a tool that you can use as well.
Great, thank you, Leah. So now we'll get into the question portion, and I know a lot of you have submitted questions on the chat, so I will go ahead and get that open and scroll up to see which ones we missed. So question from Jody Morgan. How does EFC work when a family has more than one student in college? So that's an excellent question, because this kind of goes back to the last question Leah was covering with should I even bother filling out the FAFSA if I know I'm not going to be eligible for anything. So the last thing that EFC calculation goes through is it gets divided by the number of students in college. So let's say the student fills out a FAFSA, right? And the EFC otherwise would be 20,000 for an EFC. If there's 2 students in college, then that expected family contribution is divided amongst both of them. So each of those students would now have a 10,000 EFC as opposed to 20,000 because there's more than one student. If there's 3 or 4, you can imagine what it's doing to that EFC. So there is, I guess you would call an advantage for having more than one student in college. If you want to look at it that way, that does mean that it's also far more expensive for the parents who are might be trying to help a student pay for college. If they have more than 1, 2, 3, or 4 students in college at the same time, that's going to get pretty expensive. So the EFC does calculate the number of students in college by reducing that EFC depending on how many students are.
Yeah, I would just
enrolled.
add that it divides the parent contribution part of that EFC. Every EFC is kind of made up of the parents' portion of that contribution and then the student themselves portion. So if you have a student that's working or has assets of their own, those things play into that EFC too. So when you're talking about dividing it, it's the parent part that divides. I just had a set of brothers come in and their EFCs were different and they couldn't figure out why. They used the same parent information on there, but one of the brothers had a part-time job and the other one did not. So their EFCs will vary based on their own earnings that way too.
Thank you, Leah. Yeah, it is the parents' portion at EFC. There is a portion for the student as well. Hopefully that does answer that question for you. Julie had a question. I'll go ahead and push this out to you. Well, actually, Leah, I'll answer this because it's something I'm currently working on. If we are doing a FAFSA night for parents, can we refer parents to you both if they have questions that are not able to be answered? Explain what's the contact number they use. So we were actually, MASFAA is meeting with MUS this week to try to figure out what is the best way that MASFAA can help with your guys' efforts with FAFSA nights. I'm going to guess that a lot of you might be doing a FAFSA night virtually somehow. At least here in the Helena area, that's what the local high schools are doing. We're doing a virtual one, and we're setting up a call center for any parents who have questions that they could call us, and we'll be providing the number for them. So kind of stay tuned on the FAFSA night. It might be a little difficult depending on when you want to do the FAFSA night, because again, we're meeting on that this week in hopes to have something a little bit more in place. But just like you guys are filling out the FAFSA and helping those out, colleges are working with new FAFSAs coming in and then the current students. So it might be a little bit delayed. We're hoping to have something provided for you guys as a resource to have your questions. If anything, if we don't have an on-the-spot time to give you an answer, like here's the number, call us when you have a question. If we don't have that available for you counselors, what we will have is a contact number that we could refer to you that we will get back to you to answer those questions, whether that be through email or through a phone call. So we're working on that right now, Julie. Hopefully it's not going to put too many people in a bind waiting for answers and get parents and or students frustrated as you're trying to figure out these more complicated questions. But we do have something in the works that we're hoping to have everything ready in the next couple of weeks. And depending on when your FAFSA night is, we might not have it ready. But I'm not trying to encourage you guys to push it back any further than what you might have already planned, because I know you guys have your entire semester probably already planned out, so you have a limited window. But we are working on something to give you high school counselors a central location to encourage all parents, students, and even you guys to contact, and then behind the scenes we will determine who's going to address those questions. Let's see other questions. So is it possible to make these slides available for us to share with parents at senior/junior nights? I believe I sent them to Amy. Amy, I don't know if you were able to send those out to the participants. If not, they should be posted somewhere for you guys to use.
Yes. Yeah, so Jaime, it is actually on the virtual fair where you all signed up to attend this. And I'm happy after we get through the question, I'll share my screen and show you. But if you go back to the session in the virtual fair, all of those documents are linked in that profile. So you can just access them there.
Great. Thank you, Amy. Leah, I'll go ahead and get this one pushed out for you. What if they are living with grandparents? Do they use the grandparents' tax return, or are they homeless?
They do not use the grandparents' tax return unless the grandparents have adopted them. It's for parents. So if that is the situation, there's usually a reason for that. And there's usually the legal guardianship or some of the other factors, orphan, that they would be answering yes to. One thing that we did not talk about was one type of special considerations that request for independent status. So If they cannot answer yes to any of those questions that are already built into the FAFSA related to dependency, sometimes there are situations where there just was no legal action taken. There just was no ability for them to be able to provide some court documentation, or that they didn't get adopted. I have a student who lives with her grandparents and has since she was 16 months old, and they did nothing to cement anything in a legal format, but she wasn't adopted. One of the ways that financial aid administrators can help students with that special consideration or the special circumstances is for the dependency override. That's usually held for really severe situations, abuse and neglect, when the student getting in contact with the parent is a dangerous situation or is just unable. They were abandoned and they don't know who they were. Then they can appeal is not the right word. They can request that special circumstance through the college. And just like the other ones that Jaime was talking about, that decision may be made at my school and may not be entertained at another school. Or if I say, yeah, we're gonna consider so-and-so as independent, and then they transfer mid-year to another school, they would have to go through that process of asking for that again at the new school. But there are ways to work around that. But no, short answer to your question, only parents. So if a student is adopted, then yes. If not, then there's probably some other factor in play that you'll want to work with the financial aid administrator at the college to see if we can get to the bottom of it.
Perfect. Thank you, Leah. Another question we got in, can you quickly define the different loans that are awarded through the FAFSA, subsidized, unsubsidized, and Parent Plus loan? So the federal subsidized loan is a loan that is not accumulating interest while the student is enrolled at least 6 credit hours or more, or half time or greater. If the student continues on after his undergrad or her undergrad through graduate school, as long as they're enrolled at least half time, no interest is being accumulated on that loan. However, for the unsubsidized loan, that loan is accumulating interest while the student is enrolled. The student does have the option to pay off that interest to avoid it from growing throughout the life of the loan while the student's enrolled and during payment as well. It's not required to, it's not mandatory. If the student decides to, it doesn't hurt them in any way. It's recommended if they are able to. It's not a bad idea if they can, but if they don't, it's not gonna cause any problems. Just know that during the life of that loan, of an unsubsidized loan, the entire time interest will be accumulating. The Parent Plus loan is a loan that the parent would apply for, and the funds would be used for the student's education. So let's say my mom applies for the Parent Plus loan and I'm the student. My mom will apply through the studentaid.gov website and submit all her information. It goes through her credit report, it checks all her information, and should she get approved, then my mom would decide, okay, how much money do I want to borrow? And it's not necessarily unlimited. The parents will have an option to choose the maximum amount. And then that would go to the financial aid office at whatever school the student is attending. And the financial aid office would determine, based on the cost of attendance and the financial need that the student has, and how much the parent would be able to borrow for that academic year. Or the parent could say, you know what, we only need $5,000 to cover the bill for the rest of the year. That's all I want to borrow, which is a good idea. Then the parent says $5,000, the school receives their loan application, and the school will certify for that amount that the parent requested. An additional thing to know about the Parent Plus loan is if the parent is not approved for the loan, the student would be eligible for an additional unsubsidized loan. So again, this is the student loan with interest while the student is enrolled. Their eligibility for that type of loan does increase for the academic year. So a lot of times parents say, well, I don't want to apply because I know I'm not going to get anything. Well, if you're not eligible and you get denied because of the adverse credit history, the student can receive additional federal loans for the academic year. So it's not a bad option for parents who think, oh, I'd like to help, but I don't think I can. If the student's willing to do an additional unsubsidized loan, then that's something they can consider if they choose to. Leah, do you have anything to add? Okay, so then I will push this next one out to you, Leah, since you kind of covered the independent status questions. For students who are emancipated, how do they file?
There's actually a question on the FAFSA related to that. So they would answer yes. to that question. One of them is, are you emancipated? And then, like Jaime said, the college may ask for some proof of documentation for that. Oftentimes, if they're answering one of these questions that it's the only thing that makes them independent, the colleges are going to want to see that documentation to make sure that they didn't just click it incorrectly or untruthfully. So if a student is emancipated, then they answer yes to the question about emancipation, and then would probably need to provide the college with the documentation about that.
Yeah, and one thing to add to, I did notice that the state of Montana has a definition for emancipated. An emancipated individual in the state of Montana is an individual who has reached 18 years of age. So if you go off of that definition, then everyone who well, not everyone who reaches 18 years of age is now, by Montana state law, emancipated. But if you continue reading on that state publication on emancipation, it says this does not apply to federal student aid. So it's very specific. It's a state law to say you're an adult basically, but for financial aid, emancipated has a different definition where the student has emancipated themselves from their parents legally.
And it's emancipated minor is the way that it's phrased on the FAFSA. So it's occurring before they become the age of majority in the state that they're resident of.
Yep, thank you. Do they use their tax return if they work? Yes. So if their student is working, I'm assuming it's this emancipated minor. If they're working, yes, it would go off of their tax information. If a parent is divorced but living with someone not remarried, but a step parent, do they use only the parent's financial information? Leah, do you want to take this one?
Sure, and that was asked prior to. What if they're just living with someone and they're not married? It's a spouse. The exception is if the student's parents are living together and not married, then both of the parent information goes on there. So say me and my husband husband wouldn't be right. Me and my partner never got married and our child was going to college and we all lived as a family in the household, then both my partner and my tax information are going to go on the FAFSA because we are his parents. But if I divorced my husband and am living with someone else and we have never married, then that step parent information, they're not technically a step parent because that parent is not remarried. Now, it can get a little tricky. Sometimes, Montana is a common law state. And so if in other factors of their life, they're purporting to be married and claiming common law for things like their mortgage or various other benefits, then they should be claiming common law on the FAFSA as well. Sometimes the person they're living with is not a wage earner and they're literally a dependent of that other parent. That's that other dependents, not children question on the FAFSA. That can be a factor as well. But for the most part, marriage is the key there unless it's the two biological parents.
Thank you, Leah. And then I think there was a follow-up question to the emancipated minor one. What if they do not work? So if they don't work, then there would be no financial information to provide for that student. So what you want to have the student do is still fill out the financial information, just enter zeros. Income earned, 0. There's no cash or savings, 0. Investments, which I would assume they don't have any, it would be 0. Just enter zeros if they still ask those questions.
Sometimes that's just the true answer. I don't have an income. And, over the years, we used to see a lot of times families or students answering 0 were almost always picked for verification. And that has kind of backed off some. There's been a real push lately, quit making poor people prove how poor they are. And so, we are seeing that reflected in the FAFSA applications as well. Not everyone who enters I did not file is going to get picked for verification anymore. So that's a good thing.
Great.
Hi.
Thank you.
May I ask a question? My name is Dory. I'm from Broadus, the school counselor here. I had a situation this year that I hope I don't ever have to experience again, but the student came to my FAFSA night and started his financial aid with me at the school and was never able to finish because he had parents who have not filed in multiple years. The student, in my opinion, based on their living situation, would have qualified for some pretty heavy financial aid, but because the parents had never filed in multiple years, how do you encourage them to keep pushing and fighting to get that aid in order to be able to go to school? In his case, he gave up and went to the workforce instead of even considering college because he felt like he couldn't finish.
Yeah, so that is a very tough situation, Dory. Thanks for asking. And unfortunately, it is more common than you would hope. Unfortunately, especially in the financial aid side, we see it quite often where parents, for one reason or another, don't file taxes. The student can still submit the FAFSA, and they would probably just kind of guesstimate what tax information would be entered if they had filed. This is roughly what they probably would have earned.
Okay.
And I might get in trouble for saying this, Leah. Maybe you want to cover your ears because you would be the one that would notice. But if they're not selected for verification, there's really no way for anybody on the campus, the Department of Education included, for them to know any of that. So if they submit it and they're not selected for verification, then they're going to receive their financial aid that they're eligible for based on that financial aid information. But is that going to happen again the following year? Who knows? They might get selected, and then that's when you're like, okay, what do we do? We've had students here at Carroll, unfortunately, whose parents refuse to file taxes, and the student is just not eligible because they don't meet any of the other circumstances. They still live with their parents. They have a relationship. They're not homeless. They can't they can't request an independent status because truly they're not. It's just the parents are refusing to. And in those cases, if we're needing tax information because of verification, we cannot proceed with any financial aid offerings until that gets completed. And again, remember, this is only for verification. Yeah. If they're not selected for verification, no one's going to ask for those tax documents. It just creates more work for everybody involved. And if they're not needing to, then I can't imagine the school would want to.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. I agree, and probably technically shouldn't agree with you on that, but you're right. I think that sometimes what's even worse is that parents haven't been filing taxes and also refuse to sign the FAFSA for the student. And then the student really is kind of out of luck, because if you can get the parent to go ahead and sign the FAFSA and put the estimated income on there and roll their dice that they're not going to pick for verification, they might get by. They might not get by next year, like you said. But if you have a student who's refusing to do the FAFSA with their students to sign it, then it really kind of, if they don't meet those other qualifications that we can kind of bend the rules around a little bit, then they really are out of luck, and it feels horrible for us and for the student and everyone involved. There is one option on the FAFSA where a student can submit it without providing parental information. My parents refused to sign. Gosh, we always try and work with those families if we can before using that option, because what that causes is for us to push through the FAFSA and allow for that student to only qualify for unsubsidized loan. Right. They can't get the Pell Grant if their EFC is 0, if that's the situation where a parent won't fill it out. It's sort of that last ditch effort, but the parents also need to certify that they don't support that child, period, like in any way. And so it feels really bad in that situation that Jaime was talking about of a student who lives with their parents and they have a relationship and it's fine. The parents just have been avoiding filing taxes. Sure. Really, they can't get aid. And if you think about it, it's a government program funded by taxpayers. So if families aren't going to, pay in, then they don't qualify for the aid. And that's really hard when it's not the student's fault.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you for all the questions. And Leah, thanks again for presenting. So our time is up. If you do have any questions, we will hopefully be participating in the next one, and I'm sure Amy will tell you a little bit more about it in October, so we could kind of go a little bit more into depth and some other questions that you probably will hear between now and then. And then also, like I said, we're meeting with NUS at the end of this week to hopefully have somewhere to point you guys for when you do have those questions or need more explanations that go far beyond what you guys are comfortable with helping students and parents. We'll get you that contact information to make sure you guys have the right resources you need to help our Montana students.
And I would just say, as always, as a quick follow-up, if you've got a student who knows they're going to go to Carroll or knows they're going to go to GFC MSU, you can always just call us. It doesn't have to be because you routed it through any sort of system. We are available to help you and your families navigate this topic.
Well, I just want to thank both Jaime and Leah for their amazing work. You got hit with a lot of hard questions. You guys did a fabulous job. So a big, big thank you to Jaime and Leah and the MASFAA team for all the amazing work they do for students. We're really grateful for your time this morning. And thanks to all the counselors who are here today. I think at one point we had up to 44 high school counselors from around the state popping in and asking questions. So great job. We will be recording this session and sharing it later, but if you guys don't have anything else, Jaime and Leah and counselors, thanks for all you do.
Thank you, everybody. Have a good day. Enjoy your week.
Everyone, we're excited to see the rest of you guys in the virtual fair all week long. Thanks, guys.